Well, now let's take a closer look at the significance of President Xi's trip to Russia. I'm joined by Anton Fedyashin, Associate Professor of History at American University. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me again.
So as we saw there, a very friendly start to this visit, a lot of warm words and some cultural diplomacy. What are the expectations during President Xi's visit?
Well, I think the expectations is that Russia and China will continue to build their relationship and deepen it. This is the 8th visit by President Xi since 2013, which is, the most frequent place he goes is Russia, and the leader he sees most frequently is Putin. So there's clearly chemistry between the two men, and they're doing their best to institutionalize what is a personal relationship into a national relationship.
So give us an idea of what's actually happening with Russia's economy at the moment.
Well, because of the Western sanctions, it is growing much slower than it would have otherwise, although the sanctions have actually favored some of its sectors, especially agriculture. The hopes initially in 2014, 2015 was that the Chinese and Asia in general would compensate for the lack of Western capital. That has not come true to the degree that the Russians were expecting. What has come true, however, is that what the Russians wanted to start back in 2010, which was a very active pivot to Asia, and that was going very slowly until 2015, thanks to the Western sanctions, was catalyzed into a very rapid process. And we're seeing today in Moscow, and during every meeting that President Xi has with Putin, the results of this. And so economically, the ties are strengthening. One of the things that the two presidents visited today was a new automobile factory in the town of Tula, which is just south of Moscow. And there, the production cycle is not just putting together Chinese cars, but it's actually making the parts for them in Russia, which is a huge step for both sides.
So obviously we know what's happening with Russia's economy and the sanctions, and of course China is involved in its own trade spat with the US and a slowdown there in the Chinese economy. What sort of opportunities then do you see as they both sort of battle their own economic issues in terms of cooperation with each other?
Well, I have to tell you, Rachelle, I'm not sure if this is intended from the US side, but picking fights with both countries at the same time is just bringing them closer together. And there's a reason why Henry Kissinger has been the most vocal and consistent critic of both the Obama administration's and the Trump administration's policies towards Russia, because he is seeing the work that he and Nixon had so brilliantly done in the early 1970s being unraveled before their eyes. They had outmaneuvered the Soviets and created a closer relationship with the Chinese and with the Soviets than they had with each other. And now the Russians are coming together with the Chinese. And it's a certain irony that the panda diplomacy is out again, because the pandas at the National Zoo here in Washington, D.C. were brought over as a result of Nixon's visit to China in February of 1972. And now the Russians seem to be receiving the same kind of treatment from the Chinese.
It certainly appears to be going full circle. Now we know that while President Xi is there, he's going to be attending the St. Petersburg Investment Summit kicking off on Thursday, and especially a new 6-year, $400 billion stimulus plan is expected to be unveiled, covering a range of sectors from infrastructure even to pianos, I understand. What do we know, not just about this plan, but how China might fit into that?
Well, the big question is the infrastructural component of this, because Russia needs to invest a lot of money in the Far East. It is a underpopulated region. Russia, of course, as most of your viewers will know, is the largest country in the world with one of the lowest population densities. And logistics in the Far East is really a nightmare. It's not only the tough climate, but the absence of a population to make road building really worth it. The Russians are hoping that the Chinese will help them develop the Far East, and they are hoping for that both in terms of real material logistics, but also in terms of internet development, because one of the things that was announced today is that Alibaba and Mail.ru and Megaphone, which is a major Russian telecommunications company, have finally completed a project they'd been talking about for a couple of years now, which is to open the Far East to e-commerce coming through Alibaba through China. So this is a huge investment and a huge project already. I imagine we'll see many more in the future.
And we did see that last year bilateral trade rose about 24.5% to a record $108 billion. A lot of that made up from Russia's energy exports to China, making them actually China's biggest energy supplier. How do you think both countries really benefit from this geographical closeness as well as this sort of political and geopolitical closeness?
Well, for the Russians, look, the Chinese are a huge energy market. That comes with costs, however. The Russians would rather export high technology and finished goods than pumping oil and gas and selling timber across the border, which is something that's happening very actively. But so far, that is what they have. That's what the Chinese thirst for. Chinese economic growth promises that they will need natural gas and oil for many years to come. China's trying to wean itself off of coal, which is a pollutant, much worse than natural gas or oil. So in that sense, the Russians are secure with a huge market. That's why the Strength of Siberia pipeline is being built. $55 billion is a huge investment. Ultimately, however, the Russian hope is that the Chinese will invest money in Russia in creating joint technological enterprises, because that's how countries really make money, and those are the jobs that attract highly qualified, educated workers. We'll see to what degree that develops over the next few years.
And certainly these warmer ties seem to be a step in that direction.
Absolutely.
Always good to have you on. Anton Fedyashin, the Associate History Professor at American University.